Welcome everyone to our Living Lab lecture series talk. My name is Kevin Gomez and with me is Christopher Rost. Together we will tell you about Hadoop, about its data model, its operators, and about the basic ideas we had building the framework. And of course, how Hadoop can handle massive temporal property graphs. I think without wasting time, let's dive into the slides. For those of you who never heard about graphs, here are some basics. In its most simple form, a graph consists only of vertices and edges. An edge always connects two vertices. Sometimes they are named nodes and relationships. Here, for example, we have a social media graph from Twitter. Here our nodes are persons and our edges represent the follows relationship between two users. If we have a look at Facebook, a graph could look like this. Here again, we have persons as nodes and the friend-of relationship as edges connecting two persons. In the real world, graphs are not that easy. Graphs are heterogeneous. That means that we have multiple types of vertices and multiple types of edges. Here in this example, we do not only have persons as nodes, but also bands, AC/DC and Metallica. And we do not only have the friend-of relationship, but also the likes relationship connecting persons and bands. The cool thing about graphs are they are easy to understand. You basically can look at it and in an instant you understand what kind of information the graph contains. And of course, they are suitable to store connected data. And they can be analyzed. For example, you can run a subgraph or a community detection algorithm. Here in this example, we identified two communities. One community with persons that likes AC/DC and one that likes Metallica. And sometimes communities can overlap, like Carol. She likes to listen to both bands. Back in the time, even before we started working on Hadoop, we knew what kind of analytics we wanted to do. We wanted to run a pipeline of analytical operators all in one system. And as we were looking at the graph landscape back then, we found basically not a single system that actually could do that. I'll give you an example what it was we imagined. Let's do a graph analytical pipeline with pen and paper. Okay, first, let's assume we have a heterogeneous social network. And the first thing we wanted to do is to determine a specific subgraph. Okay. Next, we want to find some communities based on an imaginary property. Okay, found them. Then let's filter those communities based on a certain metric, for example, the vertex count. Okay, perfect. And last, let's search for some common structures within the communities using pattern matching or some other kind of algorithm. Okay, at this point, the graph left is the result of the analytical pipeline on the right side. And you can imagine that it's hard to find a system that can perform this kind of analytical pipeline. And here's why. If you have a system that can do this type of analytics, then your system has to meet some certain requirements. If you want to determine a subgraph, then your system should be able to apply graph transformation. If you want to find communities, then your system should be able to handle collections of graphs. If you want to filter communities, then aggregation and selection becomes important. And if you want to find common subgraphs, then your system should be able to apply dedicated algorithms. And let's not forget, graphs are huge, with billions of vertices and even trillions of edges. Given all that requirements and facing the problem of handling those large graphs, we decided to start building Hadoop. And today, Hadoop is an open source framework and research platform for the efficient and distributed analytics of heterogeneous and bitemporal graph data. Hadoop itself is embedded in the Hadoop ecosystem. That means on the lowest level, we operate on a shared nothing cluster. On the level above, we have Hadoop and its distributed file system to store, read, and write data. We also support data sources like Apache HBase and Apache Accumulo. On top of that, we use Apache Flink and their dataset API as an execution engine. Flink handles details like data distribution and communication between the workers of the cluster. And above all that, Hadoop takes place. We support currently two different kinds of graph data models, the ePGM and the newer tPGM. And we provide a fairly big size of graph operators and graph algorithms. We bundle Hadoop as a Maven project. That means if you want to get in touch with Hadoop and use it in your Java project, then you only have to include our Maven dependency. That's it for my part. Now Christopher will take over and tell you a little bit about the temporal property graph model in Hadoop and about the Temporal Graph Explorer. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin, for that introduction to graphs, graph models, graph analytics, and our temporal graph analysis system, Hadoop. Now I will talk about the temporal property graph model and some applications. You will see here in our architectural draft the temporal property graph model in this yellow box as one main feature of Hadoop. And this graph model is not just a graph model as data structure, but contains also a set of operators that are that can be used to analyze this graph. And in addition to the data model and these operators, we provide also an analytical language which describes how you can use these operators to solve an analytical problem. And I will start with the data model, so a description of the data model itself. So the temporal property graph has, like any other graph model, vertices and edges. You see here a toy example on the left side. In addition, our property graph model has logical graphs, which are an abstraction of subgraphs. So to assign vertices and edges to like a semantic element of graphs. So we see here that these two vertices at the top and its edge are assigned to that top subgraph, and the other vertices and edges are assigned to the subgraph at the bottom, or the logical graph at the bottom. In addition to vertices, edges, and logical graphs, we have unique identifiers. That's quite usual. We have, like in the property graph model, type labels. Type labels describe the vertices and edges. So we have here our vertices described by places and stations, and our edges are trips between these places and stations. And you will see, okay, this is it leads to an example of a bike rental network here. That means we have some places in the city and some fixed rental stations, and when a user rents a bike, then there is a trip between two places or between a place and a station or so on. And our logical graphs are the districts in a city here. Okay, besides type labels, we have bitemporal attributes. So this is quite interesting because there we have our the meaning of the temporal in the temporal property graph model. So we say, okay, each vertex and edge has two time intervals assigned. One time interval, the valid time, describes, okay, when this element is valid in the real world. For example, a bike trip is valid in the real world when the trip starts until the trip ends. You see here the edge with number 1. The trip starts at 8 o'clock and ends at 10 o'clock and 2 minutes, for example. Or the validity of a place, for example, starts at here, like place number 2 starts at 6 a.m. and has an infinite validity. That means we didn't know, okay, when the validity of the place ends. That means, okay, are there maybe any other trips from that place or not? And the second time interval is the transaction time. So it's abbreviated with TX. So it's the lower temporal value below our graph elements. And this describes, okay, when this information about that real world event was inserted into our graph. That means when our graph knows about the happening of that event. For example, here our trips are inserted into the graph every full hour. Trip number 1, for example, ends in the real world at 10:02, and it was inserted into our graph at 11 o'clock. So that means we have now our graph with two time dimensions, the valid time that describes the validity in the real world, and the transaction time that describes the validity on our analysis system. And in addition to this, these bitemporal attributes, we have properties assigned to the vertices and edges. Properties are just like key value pairs that describes this entity or this relationships further. For example, a trip has a property bike with the identifier of the used bicycle and an identifier for the user that made that trip. Or in addition, a place property, for example, has a latitude and longitude, so some spatial information, and a name for that place, or stations has also latitude, longitude, and a name. Okay, that's it. These are the characteristics of our data model. And now one could ask, okay, what can I do now with these kind of graphs? So how can I analyze a graph in this structure, so a TPGM graph? And therefore, you have here a summary of selected operators of Hadoop. So we have this operator concept, as you can imagine, like a toolbox of small analytical tasks. And these analytical tasks, we call them operators, they can be chained together to build a more complex analytical workflow. And we divide the input type of our operators. You see it on the left side. We divide them by temporal graphs and graph collections. So a temporal graph is one logical graph instance, like a district from the example before. And a collection are a set of such temporal graphs or logical graphs. For example, all districts of a city. And then we divide our operators in unary and binary operators. So unary operators consume one input element, so for example, one temporal graph or one graph collection. And binary operators consume two of them, so two temporal graphs or two temporal collections. And on the right side, we also offer some algorithms that are capsuled as operators too. So for example, we choose here one operator, the binary operator combination. So combination takes two temporal graphs as input, combines both in one logical or temporal graph, and outputs that temporal graph. So that means, for example, the combination can be used to merge two districts of a city, for example. Or overlap calculates all overlapping elements of two input graphs. So the most used ones, I think, are the unary operators of a single graph. So like the temporal pattern matching is quite interesting. The time-dependent grouping, we will see that in a demo application afterwards. And also a snapshot is needed to travel through the time in our graph. And in addition, so these dark boxes, we also provide auxiliary operators like call. And in call, you can input your own graph algorithm or your own analytical tasks. So if you have a special kind of analysis, you can use these auxiliary operators to also apply this algorithm on a TPGM graph. And to get a feeling, okay, how such a workflow with these combined operators could look like, I prepared here an example. So this could be a small pipeline of analytical operators. You have the input graph on the left side. Afterwards, we apply a snapshot to get a specific point in time of our graph. Then the user applies here is user-defined algorithm, for example. Afterwards, we apply a pattern matching on the results of that algorithm. Then we found an amount of matches in our graph, and we reduce these matches in one single graph again with the reduce operator. And afterwards, we group that graph, apply a subgraph, that means a filtering on that, and we get our analysis result here, which includes some value for us we want to know. And so this could be a typical workflow. And in our Koala language, so the language where you can define such kind of workflow, it looks like the following. So it's quite simplified example. So we apply here our operators in Java API. So we say, okay, we have a graph named G, apply our snapshot, then the call operator, then the query operator, this is the temporal pattern matching. Afterwards, to reduce the group by and subgraph. And the result of that operator chain we store in an object called result. And now we can do something with that result. For example, print it on the shell or output it to a CSV file or so on. So I think with that you get a feeling how such an analytical pipeline could look like. We selected 3 of our temporal operators. You see them here highlighted on the left side, so the time-dependent grouping, snapshot, and difference, and built a demo application around these 3 operators to show, okay, how these operators can be configured and what is the result of these operators when I apply them on a graph dataset. And therefore, so to show the usability or the configuration possibilities of that operators, we built a demonstration application called the Temporal Graph Explorer. The Graph Explorer is available on GitHub, so open source. You can have a look at it, you can contribute, or you can just download it and try it by your own. And in addition, the Graph Explorer is also available in the ScaDS Living Lab in Leipzig, so you can come and play around with that application and see the usage of these operators. And now I will switch to the demo application and show you the usage of these operators. So this is the Temporal Graph Explorer. In the top menu, you see the 3 operators we selected for this demonstrator. So snapshot, difference, and temporal grouping. On the left side, you will see a configuration panel for that selected operator. And on the right side, you see the graph visualization. The data sets we will use today are provided by the company Nextbike. So Nextbike is one of the leading bike rental companies of Europe. So in more than 60 cities in Europe, Nextbikes are available for renting. And the company provided us a data set with a history of 3 months with all bike rentals that happened in Leipzig. And for our first operator, so the snapshot operator, we select here our graph. It's called the first top next bike. So we calculated with Hadoop which bike has is rented the most in Leipzig. And we filtered by that bike, and you will see here on the right side, okay, so in which areas of Leipzig this bike drives through. And for example, when we zoom in, we see here a place at the Kali in the south of Leipzig, and there was a rental to the eastern part of Leipzig, represented by that edge here. And when we click on that edge, we see all information of that app. For example, the bike ID, the duration in seconds, the customer ID who rented that bike. And at the bottom, you see the temporal attributes, so the transaction timestamps and the valid timestamps. And here, the valid timestamp represent the rental period of that specific trip. So that means this bike was rented here on the 1st of June at 0:26 and is given back at 0:38. And then we can follow the path of that bike. Now it goes from the eastern part of Leipzig to the southern part, from the southern part to the western part, and so on. And somewhere also here in the south at the Kosputner See. Yeah, that means with this filtering to one bike, we see the whole track of that bike through Leipzig. And now we can not just have a look at the whole history, but select a specific timestamp. That means we choose the same graph here, but we will select the predicate as of. As of means that we select the graph at a specific point in time. And this specific point in time is here the 30th of August at 10 a.m. And we will see in our visualization at 10 a.m. there was just one rental of that bike. When we click on that, you see, okay, it was rented at 9:47 and given back at 10 and 1 minute. And that means we can also go back in time to that specific point in time to see, okay, which rental has happened at that time. So in addition, we can also select the complete next bike data set. So all bike rentals that are available, and then choose a period of time for our snapshot. So we select the predicate from 2 and choose timestamps here, 1st of August at 10 a.m. and 10 minutes later, we will end our period. And you will see here, okay, we have a huge amount of places in Leipzig, and all brown edges here are bikes that, or bike trips that overlap these 10 minutes that are selected here on the left side. And because the detail of the spatial information is quite high, it's also possible with Hadoop to cluster all vertices together to interesting points in Leipzig. That means all places that are close together are clustered to one cluster center, and we can select now that clustered graph here for our visualization, have the same configured snapshot operator executed, and now we will see, okay, Leipzig had not this huge amount of places, but also 30 places here, 30 interesting places. And you will see here, okay, how these places are connected in these 10 minutes with rentals. Now, for example, here in the city of Leipzig, we have several rentals, and in the eastern part. Okay, so this is the main idea of the snapshot operator, to select a specific point in time or period of time from our historical data set. So the next operator is the difference operator. So difference operator is used to compare 2 points in time or 2 periods in time of the graph. And to show its usage, we see here on the left side, we define a first snapshot. It is here the 30th of August at 10 a.m. and a second snapshot below at 10:15 the same day. And when we execute it, we will see here our different graph on the right side. So every red element is available in the first snapshot, but not in the second one. And every green element is available in the second snapshot, but not in the first one. That means we have now here a colorized view of how a graph evolves between 2 points in time. And you see here, okay, the validity of that place is gray. That means, okay, this place is valid in both of these snapshots. That means when we click here on the red one, we see, okay, it's from 9:47 until 10 and 1. And this trip is from 10:14 to 10:21. Okay, so this is an example usage of the difference operator. And the last operator I will show today is the temporal grouping. So I will pre-configure here our grouping. So the main idea of the grouping operator is to summarize or to group vertices of a certain characteristic together, and to group edges of a certain characteristic together. And each grouped vertex and each grouped edge can now have an aggregated value on it. For example, for the trips, the average duration of all trips that are grouped together. And so we can select a graph on the left side. We have some key functions that specify, okay, on which characteristics the vertices and edges were grouped together. And we can define some aggregate functions where we can say, okay, how the values of these groups are calculated here. And what you can see here on the right side, we've selected a graph with just 3 clustered places in Leipzig. We see here a place in Konnewitz, a place in Schleusig, and a place at the Kostbucher See. And when we zoom in, we see here the grouped edges. For example, here we have 147 trips from Konnewitz to the Kostkutner See, and also 147 trips back from the Kostkutner See to Konnewitz. And to have also some other aggregate functions here, not only the count, we can add some here on the left side. So we say, okay, we want to know the average duration of edges in minutes, and also for example, the maximum duration of edges in hours. So we execute it and wait short for the result. Okay, so we have the same graph here, but now our edges are extended with 2 additional properties. We have the average duration in minutes, or like 50 minutes here, and we have the maximum duration in hours. It's more than it's 5.6 hours for all trips here from Konnewitz to the Kostkutner See. And for the back trip, we have an average duration of 70 minutes, or about 70 minutes, and maximum duration are 22 hours. So you see this grouping operator is quite complex. So you can do a lot of analysis with it, and I think okay, it's now you get an idea for which cases this Temporal Graph Explorer can be used for the specific use case here. And now we will come to the end of our talk, and I will show you the further research of our domain and a short summary. Okay, so with Hadoop we can model and analyze a historical graph data set, but in the future we are looking towards graph stream analysis. That means we want to analyze a graph in real time. So at the moment when the graph elements were created in our observed domain. A second point of ongoing research are entity resolution. So to integrate graph data from different sources needs some specific entity resolution tasks. And in our institute also developed a system called FAMER, which used Hadoop as a base of its implementation. And FAMER is used for multi-source entity resolution. In addition, we are building a Hadoop service. It's a user interface that can be used by people who have no programming skills. And in the Hadoop service, so similar to the demo we saw before, you can configure operators, but in addition, you can also chain that operators together and visualize the result. And the last point of ongoing research is graph machine learning. For example, to use it for vertex and edge classification and for link prediction. So these are our ongoing research. And to sum up our talk, so you heard about temporal graphs and its main characteristics. There are different ways to analyze these large and temporal graphs. And you can use Hadoop and its temporal property graph model to analyze such graphs. We provide several operators that you can chain together to build your analytical workflow. And we have a short or a small demo application where you can test 3 of these operators. And if you want more information, then visit Hadoop.com. It redirects to our GitHub page of Hadoop, and there you find also a wiki site where everything is explained that you need to know about Hadoop. And you can also check out our publications if you want to know more about Hadoop and its feature set. So thank you again for listening to our talk. And now we will answer questions, and looking forward to a good discussion. Thank you very much.